Hi there. Today we're going to talk a bit about biometrics and take a closer look at the risks and benefits. We're going to focus in particular on the humanitarian sector, but it contains a lot of lessons for the nonprofit sector more widely. The use of biometrics in the sector is not new, but it has been picking up speed, and that's because as pressures on the humanitarian sector increase to do more with less, biometrics, like many other emerging technologies, is being spotlighted as a potential answer to some of these questions. I think before we start discussion, it's useful to get some grounding. Though biometrics may be a technical system, it fundamentally shapes the way that impacted communities experience and engage with humanitarian organizations and their operations. So it has a life beyond the mere technicalities. So when we think about assessing the use of the technology, it's important to take a holistic approach, one that's guided by the importance of understanding protection risks in context, and one that's centering the ability of people to protect themselves. When thinking about biometrics and how to assess benefits and risks, we need to be wary of this kind of binary assessment of pros and cons, of directly comparing benefits against risks as though they are of equal weight. For instance, the trauma of fearing your citizenship is in jeopardy, which is a case that we'll see with Kenya, comparing that to having more traceability or tracking of service delivery, which is a claimed benefit of biometrics, feels difficult. And that's because they're not necessarily equitable or directly comparable. So we have to accept from the outset these discussions are and will be complex, and they cannot be resolved through a kind of simple cost-benefit analysis or balance sheet. So a little bit of background on biometrics. Biometrics is often used in two different contexts, for verification or for identification. Verification is one-to-one, so making sure that you are who you say you are. If I present a card that says that my name is Quito, they will check my biometric information against what is registered under the name Quito. So this checks live biometric data from an individual against the record to determine if they're who they claim to be. And that's often used by organizations to help service delivery. So cash assistance, food, healthcare, medicine, and so on, making sure that it is reaching the intended recipient. And usually this forms part of a functional system. Functional system is a system that's designed to address a certain demand or sectoral use case. So we have things like voter IDs, driver license, health registers, financial service registers, and so on. Most use cases in the humanitarian sector fall under that category, not that they are voter ID or driver licenses, but they perform a similar function in that they're about addressing a specific demand. Biometrics for identification is the other use case, so one-to-many, and that's used to identify an individual within an identity in a whole database. So to answer the who are you question, right? And that system is compared, an individual's biometric data is compared against a database of biometric profiles to assert a unique identity. This is usually used in the case of a foundational system, which is a general or multi-purpose ID system like national IDs, national population registers. In the humanitarian sector, this is most relevant to the UNHCR because that's the only organization with a legal mandate. Both technologies use kind of similar underlying systems of summarization called templating, which summarizes key markers. So the ridges and valleys of fingerprints, for instance, are captured from the raw image of a biometric template, and that creates a mathematical representation of these features, and that's what's being checked. Biometric information is so sensitive for three main reasons, and these are the reasons that we're so concerned and where the risks kind of arise from. Uniqueness and immutability, but your personal data, your biometric data, is unique to you in a way that names or addresses and so on are not, and we cannot change these features, which makes it very difficult to ensure that they're properly protected, but also means that they can be used for a wide variety of purposes other than the initial use case. Which links to the second point about richness of information. Biometric data can sometimes convey more information about a person than is intended. For instance, palm prints, you can infer a specific condition such as Down syndrome, right? And in that sense, the biometric data collected may provide more information than the original purpose envisioned. So that's why its misuse, abuse, loss, theft can be greater than other forms of personal data. And lastly, the flexibility of use, which kind of combines those earlier two. While in one context, biometric data could be used for aid distribution, in other contexts, it could be used for monitoring and surveillance purposes. There's essentially no way to limit biometric data to the initial purpose or use. And that makes it particularly important to think about the risks. Before we look at risks, though, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these benefits, because assessing benefits and harms can often be a contested process. But in our recent research, we've seen much more evidence of harms than benefits emerge, and the evidence of benefits remains scarce. However, the anticipated benefits of using biometrics include improving the process of aid distribution due to greater registration efficiency, more traceability, deduplication and fraud control, increased accuracy of data, and also use of it as an anti-corruption tool. The claim is that there'll be economic benefits for individuals because they have a legal identity and kind of access to financial services. And there's also economic benefits for organizations, like reduced operational costs from the combating duplication and corruption. But much of the evidence we actually found for benefits came from outside of the sector, mostly the development sector. And they didn't really evidence those particular claims set out by the humanitarian sector. I think that's important because it's important to understand that benefits are, even if there is evidence for them, might not be transferable. But also, I think there's a reason to query the extent to which claim benefits can actually be realized, right? So efficiency, the claims of efficiency could be limited by operational challenges. Biometric systems, for instance, require supporting infrastructure that could be difficult to deploy in certain contexts, particularly in the humanitarian context. Or certain measurements of benefits may be too limiting. For instance, financial savings do not account for the gains or losses or disruptions faced by aid beneficiaries or their communities. So some of these benefits are directly linked to risks. For instance, accuracy of data is often buttressed by collecting larger quantities of data, right? And that can undermine the initial benefit by increasing risk because there's now more data to look after. Quick look at harms then. I think we've seen a lot more evidence of harms as both biometric systems as both the cause and amplifier of risk and harm, the technical risk of things like function creep, potential for surveillance, the misuse of data for locating and discriminating against refugees or people on the move, the reliance on third-party providers risking vendor locking, and perhaps more importantly, the reliance on tools developed for commercial purposes by actors with different threat models and value systems that may not be appropriate for humanitarian contexts, all create and raise concern around introducing these systems. There are also socio-political risks like potential harms of institutional contexts, the limitations of informed consent, a lack of accountability mechanisms, and the challenges of refusing to share information. Once you have it, it can be hard to say no. There are also relational harms that might result from a lack of meaningful alternatives, which can limit the extent to which we can consider it possible for real informed consent to be given for biometric data collection. There's often little transparency around data flows and third-party data sharing, and refugees often lack both knowledge and control necessary to have a meaningful say in how their biometric data is used. So it's quite difficult to make sure that impacted communities are empowered in this process. So there's been a few recent case studies that I think are important to highlight. In Bangladesh, Kenya, and Yemen, we see the complexities of deploying biometrics and can see the importance of considering the full scope of potential harms. So there's more detail on the slide, but just a quick summary. In Myanmar, non-consensual data sharing is indicative of the challenges of consent. UNHCR shared biometric data with Bangladesh, who shared this data with the Myanmar government, and interviews with refugees indicate that they were not aware that that's how the information would be used. In Kenya, we see challenges around double registration, where there's a clear lengthiness of trying to get redress for incorrect inclusion. And it demonstrates, I think, the challenges of trying to argue with the machine, right? Once biometrics is introduced, can be very difficult to overturn the decision-making it's facilitating. Lastly, tension in Yemen between the Houthis and WFP regarding Houthi demands to administer the biometric system, which resulted in a temporary suspension of aid that left individuals in Sana'a without critical assistance. And what we see across all of these three is that there's often a lot of unintentional harms and consequences that can accompany biometrics. Very quickly then, we can't touch on all of these things, but I think important to think about what responsible biometric policies would include, and I'm going to go through them quickly, but you can pause and take a look at the slides later. First, there needs to be continued interrogation of the necessity for biometrics. Second, more nuanced policy design and implementation. Third, establishing community-centered standards of practice. Fourth, strengthening practices around data protection impact assessments, and lastly, more sophisticated ecosystem-wide analysis of technology. I'm highlighting these here for later conversation discussion to help inspire you and spark conversation. More accurately weighing potential benefits that underpin the common justifications for biometrics, like compliance, accountability, reporting, and having nuanced discussions when they are simply incomparable to potential harms, is a collective first step that requires all parties to take a more reasoned, balanced, and engaged consideration of biometrics. So hopefully we can have more of that conversation later today. And I really look forward to hearing your thoughts on that.